All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. We should have gotten a bigger room.
Right.
It's good to see so many new faces here, and we know who you're here for. We have a very special guest, a world-renowned economist who works at the LBJ School. He was briefly on staff in Congress and became the executive director of the Joint Economic Committee. Now he heads the Texas Inequality Project, which has been described as pioneering inequality measurement. So he knows what he's talking about. Everybody, please welcome Dr. James Galbraith.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Two quick notes on that very generous and appropriately short introduction.
Yeah.
By briefly, Eli means I was there for 10 years. But the other point has to do with the size of the room. The very first political lesson I ever learned, which was that if you want to have a successful political event, book a room that is about 2 sizes too small. You can see that our organizers are already on their way to being fully professional. I thought I'd start by giving you this question here: is why am I here? Why am I here to speak on behalf of Bernie Sanders? I'd give you a little personal political history, which may be interesting. My first presidential campaign was 1968. A campaign in Wisconsin for Eugene McCarthy. I was at the convention in Chicago in that year, which ended rather bleakly in what was later described accurately as a police riot. I was the first student volunteer for George McGovern's campaign. I signed up in 1970, and in the summer of 1971, I was the deputy national student organizer for George McGovern. In 1976, which was the first year that there were meaningful Iowa caucuses, I spent 2 weeks or so in the state campaign for Bruce. It was really a great figure. I wrote a speech for him in 24. But he went up to the Wharton School to deliver, and the first question was from an aficionado of Lyndon LaRouche. He said, "Congressman, that's all very well and good, but you haven't said anything about the fact that the United States and the Soviet Union are about to annihilate each other in thermonuclear war." And he paused and looked back at the gentleman and said, "If that is true, I would deplore it." In 1980, I did some work for Ted Kennedy. In 1984, I worked for all 3 Democratic candidates, Walter Mondale, Gary Hart, and Jesse Jackson, voting for Jackson. In 1987, I was Gary Hart's economic advisor, and I wrote the last speech he gave before the Donna Rice affair forced him out of the race. In 1992, I did some work for Tom Harkin. In 1996, there was no point. In 2000, I was with Bill Bradley. In 2004, I was for anybody who wasn't George W. Bush. And in 2008, I wrote issue papers for John Edwards. And those were quite successful in their way. When Edwards was forced from the race, I went up to Chicago to meet with Barack Obama's issues person, Austin Goolsbee. And I noticed that he just had one other person at the office. I said, "How did you guys produce all these position papers with just new staff?" He said, "It was easy, we stole yours." In any event, so there we are. You can see it is a lifelong record of engagement in presidential politics that is completely unmarked by anything remotely resembling success. And so this year, I decided I would stay out. Obviously, I wasn't in a position to do anybody any good, so at the start of 2015, I went off to play in a different political arena, which is to say, to help my friend Yanis Varoufakis, who had just joined the newly elected government of Greece. So you can see that even at the international level, I was involved in nothing but hopeless causes. At the start of last year, though, I did get a communication from someone I've known and worked with intermittently for many years as Bernie Sanders' chief of staff, to the effect that Senator Sanders was about to become the ranking minority member of the Senate Budget Committee, and could I suggest someone to be his chief economist. To avoid the possibility that I might have to do it myself, I suggested someone else who was in fact hired. So I've been in friendly contact with the senator from the start of this adventure. Also, when I got to Greece, there would be occasionally a story in the Greek newspapers, and the story would be under a headline which had this word in it, which began to be the word that I became sort of initiated my familiarity with the Greek language, which I otherwise have no command over at all. This was the word. If you can read Greek, you know that that is Vermont. And the face under the headline above the story was the face of our friend. What was he doing? He was taking time out of his senatorial duties, his duties on the Budget Committee, and his completely quixotic presidential campaign in order to say a few words about an issue that he thought was worth speaking to, even though it had no bearing on American politics, which was the mistreatment of Greece by the European Central Bank and the European Commission, the government of Germany. I thought, this is really a very decent time. Nobody else in the United States had this. It was our friend made that felt very much in a situation where it was, in some sense, morally important and authentic that people of goodwill would agree. So that's not, of course, the only connection I have to Senator Sanders. This is a connection I'm a part-time Vermonter. Goes back many years, although I didn't actually meet him until this summer, when after the end of the adventure, experiment, and resistance and attempts to negotiate, he actually sponsored a morning-long seminar, symposium in the Senate office building to raise these questions about what happened for an American audience. Again, taking time off from what by that point was already become increasingly interesting presidential campaign. So that's at a personal level something about the sort of person that I think Bernie Sanders actually is. Someone who has been around in politics for quite a long time, has thought about his positions quite carefully, and has held to them in a very serious way. And someone who therefore represents a chance to do something in this country, something which has not been effectively achieved, many have tried, for the entire span of my political lifetime since the 1970s. And what is that? Well, I think it is to expand and extend the basic institutions which give the United States its moral and social qualities. Institutions which have only imperfectly been developed over the course of the entire century, beginning with Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal in 1923, and building in the 1960s under John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, and then struggling with imperfect additions in administrations like Barack Obama, including especially healthcare. But the kind of society that has been envisaged over that entire continuum is a society which provides a decent amount of mutual support on essential questions of how to live. It provides for an adequate retirement fuel that provides actual health care in a way that is not an enormous amount of money siphoned off from pharmaceutical companies, wealthy specialists, to private insurance companies, healthcare arena, that provides education at a reasonable cost to the Sanders idea. And in order to make that possible, one has to have a president who has got a reasonable willingness to resist the temptation to go to war unnecessarily, and who is skeptical of alarmism and belligerence. Obviously, that's a very delicate set of questions which require judgment because there are real dangers here. But at the same time, there are also people who seek to take political advantage of those dangers by frightening people into anger. And it requires someone with a certain amount of judgment to hold the line in an appropriate way. And so I think you have a candidate with those qualities. And let's say just one or two more things that I think of central importance, especially to someone like me with the issues that I have been concerned with in recent my profession. One of them is inequality. It is clear that over the course of the last 3 decades, we have seen an increasing tendency to the control of the country by oligarchs and elites, which is the real political meaning of rising inequality. See this in the possibility that if Bernie Sanders becomes the nominee, he might have 2 opponents, one of them named Trump and the other one named both have let's say very considerable personal net worth, billions. And that's a real statement about the direction politics is taking. It's not to say that we haven't had wealthy presidents. Roosevelt was wealthy, John F. Kennedy was wealthy. But they only became president because they had the backing of large parts of civil society, organized trade, of fully fledged political organizations, of a community of professors and intellectual societies for whom whose voices carried society.
Sir,
yes.
If you can forgive me, could you just project a little bit?
Sorry, I will try to do that.
Okay.
My voice is
Yeah, sorry to
notoriously
interrupt you,
flat,
sir.
so I will do my best. And that's not what we're talking about with Bloomberg and Trump. We're talking about 2 people whose political presence is entirely based on their personal net worth. They wouldn't be remotely plausible as political figures if it weren't for that, and whose credibility as candidates is based upon their ability to pay out of their own pockets for the presidency. That's what we're looking at in America today. That is the consequence of the rise in inequality that one can document in the data. There are other consequences, obviously, which have to do with the differences in living standards, but this one is especially important. It's especially important. It raises the question of whether one really lives in a democratic society, in a society where your voices count for something, or whether it's only the voices of a small number of people who have particular position inherited or gained through business operations and influence. That's an important question. And the second question, which is actually very closely related, which is strongly, in my mind, on this, has to do with the community that has come to dominate the Democratic Party. in the last several decades, really since the middle 1980s. This is a phenomenon. It was not true in the McGovern era. It was not true of Udall. It was not true in 1980 of either Carter or Ted Kennedy. But beginning in 1984, the Democratic Party fell under the flaw of its Wall Street financiers. People who have liberal values in certain respects, in some cases, in some areas, in important areas, socially progressive, but who on economic questions represent, because they are, in fact, the leaders, among the leaders of a community of high finance. People who rose to run the Treasury Department in the Clinton administration, for example, who's been a patron of the financial officials and economists who have been in that administration and to a very substantial extent in the present one. And to me, to my way of thinking, this is not sound as economics or acceptable as a political situation. We need to have a Democratic Party which is responsive to the people who are its voters and its members. Responsible to working people, responsible to families, responsible to students, responsible to the people who are out in the country, and which is financed by those people. And the last campaign before this one that was financed, really financed by small donors, was 1972. This one is an extraordinary phenomenon in that respect, because money has come in from tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, a million small donors. There's a number out there, I don't know exactly what it is, but it's very large. And that number has met and matched the financial power so far of the competing candidates. So I am really a camp follower here. I've always had the sympathy for Bernie Sanders. I've been along these political circles for a long time. He's been around. He's been right on the issues for a long time. But like everyone else, I thought at the beginning of last year this was basically a quixotic campaign. Something that would fall by the wayside relatively quickly. And what we've discovered is that is not the case. We are now, a week from the first primary, and I saw the polls for what they're worth. Iowa is notoriously difficult to poll, but as of the most recent reading a few hours ago, the difference between Senator Sanders and Secretary Clinton was essentially zero, less than 1 full percentage point, well within the margin of error, which is about 5 percentage points in those polls. So this is an open race. It's an open race that will be shaped by the news that comes out of Iowa, the news that comes out of New Hampshire, and then what happens in the subsequent states. I don't underestimate either the talent or the ability of Secretary Clinton, nor her support, built up over many years in important parts of the country, important parts of the Democratic constituency. This is important to recognize. She is not a bad person. If you watched her last night, I thought she was very impressive on the CNN tape. But at the same time, she represents a continuity of policy at a time when we need to have a significant change, not only of policy, but of personnel, of direction. We need to have a moral leadership that redefines the country and the community that we're part of. And I think that Bernie Sanders is a far more effective voice. And I'll give you just one other. This has happened before. It's happened before. Okay, relatively recently from my point of view, not necessarily. But in a different part of the political spectrum, and that was on the Republican side in the election of 1980, which elected Ronald Reagan. Who was Ronald Reagan? He was a figure who had been in the wilderness of his own party for a long period of time, who campaigned against the establishment figures of his day on the basis of a set of principles, which frankly I knew the Reagan people because I was on the congressional staff fighting against them every hour of my working day. I recovered my waking day in those years. But I think a fair number of them actually believed rather implausible things that would advance this economics. And what Reagan did was to project to the country a vision which was positive, in many ways reassuring, and that brought a fairly large share of the American public with you, that redefined politics into which you were brought up. It's possible for a figure whose values are closer to ours, but whose abilities are not dissimilar, to do the same thing. And that will mean, if that happens, if it were to happen, that we will be going forward for the next 20 or 30 years in a very different political climate. And perhaps with a political party which really means something to be part of, and a government which is more responsive, more open, more balanced, and in which we begin to recover from the kind of from the deep imbalance of power under which we've been living for the last few years. So that's why I think this is really an important moment. I think everybody's here because they sense this is an important moment. It's for me, the last time my candidate got as far as the convention was 1972. I was there. I was on the floor. I had a vote. I was an alternate in the Massachusetts delegation. So I feel young again. I envy you for being part of this. Excellent.
Okay, we'll now do questions and answers. Just raise your hand and click to follow.
Go ahead.
One concern that people have with Bernie Sanders is pragmatism. How can he get things done in the White House and cooperate with Congress? I think Paul Krugman recently wrote an article effectively endorsing Hillary Clinton on those grounds. Do you have a response to that or something to add to that discussion?
I have a very long-standing relationship with Paul Krugman, so yes, I'm happy to respond to this. In the first place, the president has enormous amounts of inherent power. The president makes appointments. The president has power of the executive order. The president conducts the policy of the country, and the president speaks to the people. All of these things are important, even if you can't get a single thing from Congress. Second point, does anybody seriously imagine that Hillary Clinton, elected president, is going to suddenly have Mitch McConnell eating out of her hand? I don't think so. So I don't think the situation is substantially different when you have President Sanders or President Clinton. And I think it makes an enormous amount of sense to have a president who is defining the issues and who isn't playing around with the illusion that just by being nice, the Republicans will be cooperative. And we tried. Obama tried that. He succeeded. Notoriously unsuccessful. But the final point, I guess, here is that this is a long-term project. And if one begins to mobilize a new political participation in the American public, then this has to begin at the level of the state legislatures, who control the districts that are sent to the House of Representatives. And until that issue has been dealt with, and the state legislatures are not being essentially bought and paid for by David and Charles Koch, then the House of Representatives will not be in play. When it is dealt with, the House of Representatives becomes is able to become, once again, representative of the balance of votes in the country as a whole. The Senate is is kind of a crapshoot because of the way the Senate seats come up on its pretty regular schedule. But we'll see what happens when one has a movement in play. I would tend to believe that a Sanders presidency would be more active along those lines, more committed along those lines than a Clinton presidency. Could be wrong, but that would be my belief. In any event, I don't see it as I don't see that Paul's argument really carries any serious weight at all. It's a council of let's say despair. And then, that gets back to the question. The other big issue is not so would Bernie Sanders be a less effective president, but is he electable? Well, if you'd asked me in January of last year, I would have said, like everybody else, it's a preposterous suggestion. But it's not a preposterous suggestion when you move from essentially 0 in the polls to 38% in the national polls against the matchup with Hillary Clinton right now. And that's before there's been a single vote. And that's on a campaign which has been, as a ABC political commentator, political strategist Matthew Dow said the other day, the most underreported phenomenon of the year, all of the news being on the side. So there we are. That raises questions about the relative strength of the two candidates. I don't know. I think Mrs. Clinton, Secretary Clinton, is an exception of the kind of political figure, resilient, tough figure. She was evident last night, but she has vulnerabilities too. So what's going to happen between now and the election that's a mug's game. I don't think anybody seriously can claim expertise on that. I do, however, I'll cite Mr. Dowd. I'm not sure that I should, but what he said was that he thought that Sanders would crush Cruz, and that he would beat Trump by more than Hillary Clinton. And that's a judgment from a detached figure. Why is that? Because for all one has to say about Bernie Sanders, various labels that one can throw at him, he's not, in fact, a polarizing figure. Watch him on television, particularly in a setting where he's not speaking to a loud audience, to an audience trying to project. But last night was a very good example, where he's talking to a moderator, or when you hear him on the radio. This is not a polarizing figure, and he wasn't a polarizing figure in the Senate. This is a gentleman who has friends, which is more than one can say of the junior senator in this state.
The concept of midterm backlash is very scary to a lot of young progressives. What can you say about the impulse of certain young people to either abstain from voting in the national election or to take a kind of response that says maybe it might be better to strategically vote for a Donald Trump or Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz figure in an attempt to get local and state progressives elected and to wake the sleeping beast of underlying national progressive movement?
Well,
Before, could you define what midterm backlash is?
well, the midterm backlash is the phenomenon that 2 years after a president comes in, the other party picks up ground. So that certainly doesn't hit Barack Obama in 2010. One can look at, there's some exceptions. George Bush in 2002, no, because of the effect of 9/11. But I think it's a very important, as a general rule of political strategy, not to be too clever for it. The race in front of us now is a race for the presidency. This should not be pursued with an arcane strategy about how one might do better in elections 2 years from now, or 3 years from now, in mind. The object of the election in front of you is to win it, and to win it with the best person that's available. Right now, it's down to 2 people, effectively. It's fair to say that Mark O'Malley is a figure, perhaps for the future. I don't dismiss him. I thought also he was very good last night on the CNN television, but he's not going to do it long enough. So it's down to a 2-person race. You make your choice, and if you are lucky enough to prevail by next summer at the convention, then you put everything you have into getting over the finish line, because the stakes at that point will be very high. And that's true, by the way, whether it's Secretary Clinton or some one of the senators. The stakes will be very high, and it will not be a race that one would want to lose. One would want to lose simply by not trying. Yeah.
One of the issues about when the public's all focused on the president and presidential elections in general is that often the most power comes in local elections, state elections, and even Congress. That's where all the legislative power tends to be centralized. The president usually is more of a speaker of the people who debate the legislation. And a consequence of that, one of the most powerful things that the president does is has a lot of foreign policy power, and that's the expertise that a lot of people feel is the most important. And so given that Hillary Clinton has a lot of experience in foreign policy, given Secretary of State experience and everything else she's done, and given that Bernie Sanders has often, when approached with foreign policy questions, has kind of, meandered a bit and not really given a clear, direct plans. How do you think he's going to be able to deal with this as president?
Well, I think it's fair to say that Hillary Clinton starts with a distinct advantage. She has been Secretary of State, so she knows the players, the personnel, maybe a little bit too well, but in any event, that's not to be sniffed at. But would she be the first president? I think she would be, to have served previously as Secretary of State. I think that would be correct. It is not a requirement
while, at least.
for the job. What?
I want to say that very early on.
Like Jefferson.
That's possible, yes.
Yeah,
No,
very
you're
early.
right.
In
You're
recent history,
right.
yes.
You're right. We might go back to Jefferson.
Yeah.
There we are. Okay, so not bad, but it's simply not a requirement. I mean, Ronald Reagan had been a governor, had therefore no foreign policy experience. George W. Bush had been a governor. His foreign policy experience was derivative from his father. And, by the way, that did not help very much, judged by the consequences of some of his actions. We can go down the list. Bill Clinton had been a governor. He was alert to the world, certainly, but he had no administrative foreign policy experience. Barack Obama had been a state senator and then a United States senator, had no foreign policy experience to speak of again. So, to my mind, that this is it is not a decisive argument for Secretary Clinton. It's certainly something that's in the corner, but it's not a decisive argument. And against it, one does have the fact that she has played foreign policy questions much more politically than Bernie Sanders has. That is to say, in particular, it was her misjudgment to vote in favor of the war and the invasion of Iraq, and his good judgment to vote against it. That was decisive, actually, I think, one of the issues that decided the 2008 election. And it's still there as a point, which suggests that that her positions are, let's say, noticeably more hawkish than his. And, okay, that's a consideration in my mind. not done. And we need a president who is very reserved in the judgment when to use military force. Because we live in a world where, frankly, military force doesn't buy you what it should buy you. Even if it's very capably administered, capably executed. The experiences of Iraq and Afghanistan have taught us that what you can accomplish with it is much less than is true. It's thought to be true. Yeah.
While on the subject of foreign policy, I was curious what you might believe to be Bernie Sanders' policy on Trans-Pacific Partnership, upkeep, and possible negotiations should they continue over presidencies, especially as compared to Hillary Clinton's possible policy.
I haven't seen the position paper, perhaps I should have, but I would be fairly confident that the Trans-Pacific Partnership would not go very far in the Sanders administration. There's just no question about that.
In the student newsletter, UT Students for Bernie Sanders, I actually shared Bernie Sanders' response to the TPP. So that wasn't the last newsletter, but the one before. So if you go on our Facebook page, follow that link on the archive, you can find it.
And the reality of these so-called trade deals is that they have represented ways in which particularly Democratic administrations reach out and make political connections with the business community for political reasons. When Bill Clinton came in, his trade representative was a lawyer from Los Angeles named Mickey Cantor. Who was Mickey Cantor? He was the finance chief of the Clinton presidential campaign. That tells you what the function of that job was. For President Obama, it was Ron Kirk. And Ron Kirk was the mayor of Dallas. Ron Kirk's not a bad guy, but his connection was to the Dallas business community. And the job was to reach out and to provide, to essentially help offset the fact that the top echelon of the business community leans Republican. That's the way these negotiations are done. They're not about advancing in some broad sense the national interest of the United States. And if you have a president who is detached from those interests, there's just no reason why he would line up behind particulars.
So during this campaign, we've seen enormous amounts of energy from Bernie supporters, but what I've also observed is that the most energized segment of our demographic seems to be rather suicidal in its long-term objective. Or in other words, we're seeing an enormous increase in the amount of people who are taking Bernie or bust pledges to not vote at all if Bernie doesn't win the nomination. And what we're seeing then is we're losing great amounts of credibility because people who would otherwise support the movement are saying if we give them too much leeway and they don't win, it's going to explode in our face. How do you think we should be able to channel the energy of the Bernie movement without leading to that type of suicidal thought process?
Well, I think what's needed now is a serious determination to persuade as many people as possible to come on board. And a certain amount of self-discipline is useful in that respect. But I would also say I wouldn't worry about it too much, because if it comes to the moment that you're referring to, and Secretary Clinton is the nominee, we know what's going to happen. Right? We know that Senator Sanders is going to back the Democratic nominee. That's clear. There's no reason why he would not. What we don't know is that the Wall Street tycoons are going to back the Democratic nominee if his name happens to be Bernie Sanders. In fact, we have a pretty good idea that they won't, because they're already putting up that balloon that says Michael Bloomberg on it. And that, by the way, is not coming from Republicans. That is coming from the home of a guy named Roger Altman, who was a senior official of the Treasury Department in the Clinton administration under Robert Rubin. Actually, early on, he was, I think, forced out for some indecorous reason after a short period of that job. But there it is. We're talking about people who have had a grip on the policies and the finances of the Democratic Party for a very long time, who are not prepared to let it go into to let those reins go into other hands. But that's an issue that really needs to be pressed, because it really is, I think, incumbent upon Secretary Clinton to repudiate that. To say, look, I expect to support the nominee of the Democratic Party, whether it is myself or somebody else. Senator Sanders will do the same, and I do not want anything to do with people who are thinking about torpedoing the Democratic nominee in order to keep their levers of control on the Democratic Party.
Something I've discovered to be very important is reaching out to the people on the right with your candidate. I helped a friend, Green Party left his friend get on the council in Oklahoma City. We did it by reaching out to the right. How would you reach out to people on the right regarding Bernie? What would you say to them?
That's an excellent question. I'm not sure I've got a really good answer, but I think you can ask them to listen to him. Just to listen to him, and they can persuade themselves that this is a reasonable, open-minded guy. This is a guy who is prepared to dialogue, has done so with the Senate, and let him make that case. There is, I think, a considerable sympathy across people whose political views are not hard and fast on questions for someone who is really quite different in spirit. So that's the best I can do at the moment, because I'm not quite sure who we are talking about specifically. But I think it's fair to say, if you look at the polls, that Sanders polls very well with independents. That's an important consideration.
Can you explain how the $15 living wage legislation that Bernie's proposing would be able to be implemented into law, especially with special cases or special groups like restaurant servers and farmhands, where they're often on the tip system or they're paid in services like housing and food and stuff like that?
Well, the idea of a $15 minimum wage, the idea of a much higher minimum wage is something I've been associated with for many years now. And actually, this is an issue, by the way, on which there is considerable left-right alliance. My great friend and ally on this question is this guy by the name of Ron Unz, who had a considerable presence in California politics, and it was the publisher of a magazine called The American Conservative, which is Pat Buchanan's vehicle. And he came to the conclusion some time ago that raising the minimum wage was an important issue for conservatives. Why? Because we have lots of big companies in this country whose workers are paid the current minimum wage and who are then supplement their earnings with food stamps. So we have the federal government shuffling funds into the pockets of workers because their companies are too stingy to pay them a living wage. If you raise the minimum wage, then that burden is on the companies themselves, and they have to compete in the market and it's a much more of a level playing field. They're not being subsidized implicitly by the federal government in this very rather demeaning way. The workers then are taking home a wage which supports the family. That's a position which appeals to a lot of conservatives. So that's, in some sense, actually one of the strongest issues on economic grounds that is in the Sanders campaign, and one of the most popular. Why is it popular? Because if you have a significant increase in the minimum wage, $12, $15 from the current level, then you're giving a lot of American workers a raise. And guess what? People tend to be in favor of getting raises. In fact, if you put it up to a vote, they'll almost always vote in favor as opposed to against, because it affects them personally. And $15 would probably get about 30% of the American workforce at the time. That's significant. It would significantly change the structure of pay in this country and greatly strengthen the basis, household formation, working families for everybody who's below the minimum wage. It's a very useful thing. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Martha. I'm a student at ACC. I'm trying to actually start a students for Bernie group over there at ACC.
Well, and you should talk to my daughter who's also an ACC.
Yay! I will talk to your class. But so what I wanted to ask you is something that I actually talked with my the sponsor. His name is Dr. Lauterbach, in case you know him about. I talked to him about. I mean, awesome. There's a UT for Bernie group. There's an ACC for Bernie group. We have a bunch of college campus coming up with these Bernie groups. And so my question was, I am a strong believer in Bernie. I honestly think he's going to win the nomination. But obviously, we have to be prepared for what if he doesn't get the nomination? What if we don't get him for president? So my main concern was with what do we do with all this awesome energy, you know, in this room or in other rooms too that we've gotten. Like we finally have millennials paying attention to stuff that like is important. What do we do with that? Because my fear is that if Bernie loses, they're gonna, you know, be disappointed. They're gonna go back to their cynical ways. And, you know, that sense of community is gonna be gone. This sense of community is gonna be gone. So, what would you recommend to students specifically who are involved with this movement? Who, I mean, what can we do? Dr. Lauterbach says join student government, but obviously this room can't do that because there's a lot of us. You know, we can't do student government. No, it's a hard
I mean,
question.
it's a serious question, and it's got a predicate, which was there was an enormous mobilization of young people, especially for President Obama in 2008. Great surge of energy and fundraising, and there was a post-election organization which quickly shut down. Why was it shut down? Because it had no function in the Obama administration, which turned to fundamentally and important areas, defense policy and financial policy, to the same people who'd been running policy under George W. Bush. Secretary Gates, who's a man with certain important qualities, stayed on as defense secretary. Ben Bernanke stayed on as chairman of the federal government. Go down the list. Timothy Geithner moved from a job at the New York Fed to the Treasury. Now, what do you need to have young activists who are around if that's what it's going to be? That will not be the case in the Sanders administration. So you can be sure that if there's a Sanders administration, the energy that is present in the campaign will carry over into an ongoing political administration. If there isn't a Sanders presidency, then it's up to you. But I think, yes, you can say people will fall back in defeat. But I can tell you, I'll go back to another experience, because I am very old. I have these experiences. That's what we were worried about in 1972. We got crushed. We carried one state, Massachusetts. The Lone Star State, it's called. We got crushed. Lots of things went wrong. It was just an absolute partnership. But the government people had been changed by that experience. And when you went forward to 1976, 4 years later, every campaign, including Jimmy Carter's, which was the successful one, was organized by people who had cut their teeth for George. Everyone. And when you went on another 12 years, 1988, there were a whole slew of presidential candidates that year. You go down the list of the names, I'm sure they would be like they mostly forgot. Every single one of them had been a significant figure in the government. Every one of them. Completely changed the political complexion of the Democratic Party. So that's what's going to happen now. These organizations, they may refocus on the state level, the local level, but they're not going to go away. They shouldn't go away. They should be part of something which really begins to build win, lose, or draw.
And I kind of want to add a comment to that. So this is something Dr. Lauterbach told me, is that we should be viewing Bernie as the best vehicle, the best candidate to address the issues that we have, right? Especially our social issues. But that's not to say that if he wins the candidacy or if he becomes president, that doesn't mean that the social issues stop existing. So I just want to really encourage everyone here to keep their eye on the issues and always be trying to address them rather than looking for one candidate to solve them all. There are a lot of problems we have.
Well said.
If I can add one thing, in the future, we're going to be inviting a list of local activists and politicians, so we agree that the organization goes beyond this one candidate, and if you want to keep being involved, that's how we're going to do it.
Go ahead.
What do you have to say about this idea that, you know, if you raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, if you put, you know, if you give corporations these higher taxes, this idea that they'll take their business elsewhere?
Well, they can't. We're talking here, the only jobs you can really take elsewhere are manufacturing jobs. Because then the products can be produced someplace else. And there are basically two kinds of manufacturing jobs in the country, those that cannot go elsewhere because you need them here in order to produce things like aircraft, or things that are already moving here. Right? But the basic reality is manufacturing jobs pay more than $15 an hour, almost across the board. These are jobs which are in the 20, 25 and up range, by and large. What we're talking about when we talk about minimum wage and bottom 30, 40% of the workforce, overwhelmingly jobs in the services sector. And those are jobs that are basically created and maintained on the ground in the United States. And that means you're basically restructuring that sector. Yes, you will be squeezing some businesses which rely on the ability to hire very low-paid people, have a lot of turnover. The model of the fast food joint operates on that principle, and it may be tough for some fast food operations, but for the overwhelming majority of businesses, you've got two effects. One is that you have the payrolls go up. The other is the customers coming through the door have more money. And that is what determines whether business is profitable. And so, on balance, it's the experience in countries which have raised the minimum wage, have maintained substantial wage floors, whether that's Australia or Britain, Germany introduced one a little while ago, is that you don't lose employment as a result. You do get a restructuring to a certain degree of industries of these sectors, and that is not a bad thing. It's a good thing.
I have two questions. I think it'll be more interesting one than the other. One is what you make of Secretary Clinton saying that receiving donations from Wall Street would direct the course of action for a candidate if they were elected. And the second one is if you've got any thoughts about the FEC essentially sitting out this election in terms of supervising what is and isn't okay. My particular fascination is with Correct the Record, the pro-Hillary super PAC, saying from their initial press release that they plan to coordinate with the campaign. They've actually been paid by the campaign to do outdoor research for the campaign itself. And they claim to be doing this on an exemption that I guess the Wall Street Journal has really questioned, but I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
I haven't tracked the FEC issue. We'll take your characterization of it stipulated. It's an important question. The FEC, it's well known, has been as toothless as possible in this recent
Well, it's not fully staffed at the moment as part of it, so that they've got a split vote. But
This is a very, very interesting and important question. On the issue of campaign finance, I actually don't think it's as transactional as that. The real question here is, to whom does one go to staff the government? It's not a question of bought and paid for. It's a question of a very deep alliance, which has been in existence for a long time, and which has been the dominant source of staffing for economic policy positions in Democratic presidencies for, the last two full administrations, Clinton and Obama, all come from Wall Street. Actually, more on the Democratic side than on the Republican side. Bush only went to Goldman Sachs for his Treasury Secretary when he was in real trouble. Henry Paulson came in. But this has been a source of the control that that sector has been that they basically name the team. And that is the difference between Clinton and Sanders, and a really fundamental difference in terms of the direction that the government would take if Bernie Sanders becomes president. Yeah, with that.
I just want to clarify a little bit about the exemption that she was talking about. So what correct the record was, they were taking advantage of 2005 loophole, which allowed exempted internet, uncompensated internet activities from regular FEC law. So you can coordinate online somehow.
But they're not uncompensated.
Yeah, some of them are. They are compensated, but the problem is the FEC has to have 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats. So you're not actually going to get much done. And in fact, when I was just to give a little bit of background, I'm currently running a Sanders PAC, not a super PAC, but a regular non-connected PAC, similar to Democracy for America in a way. And when we were first starting out, one of our goals was to maybe see if we could take advantage of some of the loopholes and then make the FEC release advisory opinions on them through the process. But what we found was that it was an incredibly strenuous process, and at the end, it could only end in gridlock. And you find something that you cannot believe they would not regulate, something like Carly for America. You can't have the name of the candidate in the committee. But what they did was conservative, authentic, responsive leadership for you and America, and they got away with it. And they used the acronym Carly for America, and you find the most blatant disrespect for FEC regulations, and you try to close the loophole, and all you find is that they gridlock even more. So on the issue of campaign finance, we can't particularly rely on the FEC to do anything. We have to change the system throughout.
One can, however, only hope that Carly for America raised a lot of money. I mean,
they raised decent amounts, but
excellent. I wish they had raised more.
Yeah, it would actually be better for us, because then they'll squabble with the Republicans.
Well, it's just
waste
the
all the
money,
money on it,
effectively
but
burning it.
Now, it's more about the precedent that they're setting. Every election cycle, another super PAC comes along and sets a bold new precedent of FEC non-intervention, which gets followed on by another.
Fair point. Go ahead, you're.
So my question sort of pertains to the protests and the energy that sort of collected in this room and other places throughout the United States for Bernie. And what it really pertains to is, have we seen more of an increase in like social unrest and political unrest, which I think we most certainly have, and that like most Americans' economic situations are getting worse and worse. And I think like we can count on maybe more of this energy to follow through into the next election, because it took a while before we got the New Deal and the Great Society. So I guess I don't really have a good question. I kind of got lost in my thoughts.
Let me just build on that a little bit. Let me come back to the Greek experience, which I lived over the last several years very intensely. If you go back to 2011 in Greece, when the whole society was coming apart, collapsing, cracking under the strain of the crisis, the recession, the austerity policies. The political alternative was the Nazis. The political alternative was a party called Golden Dawn, which is openly Nazi. It's not neo-Nazi, it's plain and Nazi. Its platform includes concentration camps for refugees. And that was the rising thing. Greek people, in the end, didn't go there. What happened over a few years before the election in January of 2015 was that the Greek people consolidated around a different vision, which was clearly articulated. My friend Yanis Varoufakis played an important role in setting it out, and it was carried forward by an attractive political leader, Alexis. He was head of something called the Coalition of the Parties of the Radical Left. In Greece, being called the socialist doesn't cut any ice. The socialists are entirely forced. The Coalition of the Parties of the Radical Left, that's really quite something. And in February, a few weeks after they took office, that government had 80% support. The entire population consolidated. So what could be happening here in the United States is something which I don't think is entirely dissimilar. You have, of course, some very harsh forces at play on the Republican side. They're called Cruz and Trump, and who are playing some very nasty themes with respect to religion, with respect to migration, with respect to people's fears and insecurities. And then you have over on our side a rather, let's call it a gentle and humane articulation of values which a great many people share, actually across the political spectrum. Left, right, and center. I think it's possible that even amongst people who are not themselves desperate, and I suspect most of the people in this room don't consider your personal situation entirely desperate, at this university. There is a sense that this is a moment when you have to do something, when you have to sort of join together, not for your own personal situation, but because you're part of something about your commitment to the country demands it. And if that's what's happening, it's not dissimilar to what happened in Greece, except that obviously we happen on a much, much larger scale and with much more significance in the world if you carry it through.
Do you have any predictions, desires, or suggestions for President Sanders as president?
For the vice president.
Yeah.
Johnson. I think it's a bit early. We'll get into that. I did make a suggestion on a listserv a few days ago that got wildly shot down, so I won't even repeat it. But I can tell you that I will advise Senator Sanders, if it comes close, to spend a little time thinking about this. And again, a little bit of personal history. I was in the Beau Rivage Motel in Miami Beach, July or August of 1972 at the Democratic National Convention. And the telephone rang on my father's room, and he learned that the vice presidential nominee was going to be a man named Kevin White, who's the mayor of a good guy, but known to Massachusetts Pauls to be difficult and possibly to have an excessive drinking problem. And there was a lot of unhappiness, besides which he hadn't been with us, he'd been with Ed Muskin. And there was a somewhat serious, somewhat immature rebellion. I was dispatched immediately to find the chairman of the Massachusetts delegation, who was Father Robert Dryden, Congressman from Newton, a tremendous figure in the anti-war movement, political history, Jesuit effort of Congress. And I found him in the lounge, and I said, Father Dryden, I have to speak with you. I pulled him aside and I said, they've chosen Kevin White President of the Kevin, his face relaxed. That's very funny. That's the same name as the guy who's mayor of Boston. Any event, Kevin White's name did not go forward. And there was an overnight search. There was a request made to the senator from Wisconsin, Gabriel Nelson, who also had a drinking problem, that wisely backed off. And so it went to an impeccable figure with no personal history of any kind, and Senator from Missouri at the top, who neglected to mention that he had gone through courses of electroshock therapy, which at the time was not considered to be, let's say, good preparation for the presidency. Vetting the vice presidential nominee was a useful thing to do. Ever since then, it has been routine to really do this thoroughly. But it was the case in 1972 that the government didn't have the nomination wrapped up until 2 or 3 days before. All of the effort was on getting that done. Choosing the next president. Yeah.
How would you respond to people who fear that free college tuition would devalue a college degree and make it comparable to a high school degree?
The proposal to get rid of college tuition for, I don't think it would devalue the college degree. I'm not 100% on board on the idea that tuition should be set at zero in public universities. I think that it's important to keep it under control. It's important to keep public universities, make them affordable to people. I think there's a case to be made for some level of tuition. Is part of the way you get commitment from students. Part of the way the university diversifies its funding base. I'm opposed to being entirely in the hands of the state legislature. University money because that puts the university in their position. I think that's a question that has to be discussed. But touching on the central question, keeping the university education affordable and expanding access to college level education is extremely important. Dealing with the students, the burden of student debt, extremely important. All of those things really have are part and parcel of the larger agenda.
What would you say to, well, first of all, Bernie Sanders' healthcare proposal, from what I've read, would actually cut healthcare costs for the government, since it would be a single-payer system, and only one person would cover one individual would cover the costs, the government. Would it add more to the budget, or would it cut the costs?
It would, of course, it would do both. We now spend about close to 20% of all spending is on healthcare in this country. And for the closest rival wealthy country, it's probably on the order of half that, maybe 12 at the outside. So where is that money going? Some of it's going into more elaborate care. A lot of it is going to private insurance companies, and a lot of it's going to pharmaceutical companies. Americans pay exorbitant prices for drugs, and that's these are issues which where you need to have a strong public presence negotiating those costs. And that's what every other country does. So if you push the private insurers to one side, you would get a significant saving. There's really no reason for them to exist. That's a historical and legal artifact. You do need the drug companies, but you need to negotiate prices with them so that we are not, so that the burden of this doesn't fall so excessively on people who takes extraction from very vulnerable people. And that's the point. Doing it through Medicare is using an established mechanism that we know works. That's, I think, the essence.
Texas, every event I see is like for Bernie Sanders, and Hillary Clinton doesn't have as much traction as Bernie in like Texas as I've seen. And there's a lot of rallies for Bernie Sanders, and there's a lot of events for Bernie Sanders, and I haven't seen any for Hillary Clinton. Why would you say this is happening? And like from a college student perspective, why do you think this is happening? Like there's no events for Hillary, but there's a lot of events for Bernie in Texas. Like Bernie has more traction in Texas than Hillary, and with primaries coming up, how does this affect like Hillary's traction?
It's a good question. I was looking around for video of Hillary Clinton rallies. Google Hillary Clinton rally, and I found it hard. The last news story that I saw was most recent was sometime in December. So I don't know exactly what is going on in that campaign, but it does seem to be that this is where the people are. Certainly where the young people are. What you say is unless you carry on.
You mind if I ask a follow-up? Why do you think millennials are so involved with Bernie Sanders and they support Bernie over Hillary?
I asked my daughter that. I had a theory, which was that while people like me who've been around for a long time know Bernie Sanders as a lone wolf, independent congressman from Vermont, senator from Vermont, that young people see him as he is now, which is a mature, inspiring politician. And she said exactly the opposite. She said, no, it's because he's been saying the same things since the 1960s. And he's for real. And I thought, oh, this is actually, from a political point of view, more sophisticated than I thought. That there is a search for authenticity, for reliability, for a sense that you're not getting a calculated statement calculated to appeal to you, but something that the candidate actually believes and would be prepared to fight for. And I think that's right. I think that's the correct judgment. That's why I'm attracted to him too. I find after the experience that we've all had, that this would make an enormous difference and actually have the presidency back in the hands of someone who was playing straight.
So we're just gonna take one more question.
Recently, I believe it's Blackstone, the CEO cited, which is a some kind of financial market institution, said that there were 3 reasons why the markets were unstable. One was, I can't remember the other 2, but one of them was the Sanders campaign. Is there any merit to that? And I guess furthermore, how do you think the markets would react under a Sanders presidency?
Well, the markets are unstable right now for a very straightforward reason. We're getting toward the end of people are seeing the end of a business cycle expansion, and we have the Federal Reserve raising interest rates, which is causing havoc in world financial markets. And we have slowdown in Europe and in China, which is causing havoc in the commodity markets. So you have inventories piling up in oil, for example, and the prices collapsing for us, which is going to affect, it actually has a stronger effect on producers who are being basically shut down because they can't meet their costs than it does on consumers who ought to be benefiting but who are still very hesitant to extend themselves and who are therefore paying down bills and increasing their saving rather than increasing their consumption spending. So this has got a depressing effect on balance on the economy and a terrifically depressing effect on the markets because people get scared and they rush to cash. They're dumping stocks and other things. This has got nothing to do with Bernie Sanders. Would there be will there be a market reaction if Bernie Sanders gets close to the nomination, or still more if he gets close to the election? Yeah, you bet there will be. Watch for it. But it will be a temporary phenomenon. This is not something which would be sustained. It would be something that would happen. I won't say intentionally. I don't know whose intention one has one tracks here, but it would be in conjunction with a general campaign to terrify the public about what would happen when Bernie Sanders wins the election. This happened, by the way. You could see this when the first TARP, the first Daylight Bill, Troubled Asset Program, was defeated in the Congress. And the Dow collapsed by 900 points that afternoon, and Congress came back in 2 years later and passed a second version of the bill. So you will see a capital markets phenomenon. Relax, it will not last long, and the money that will be lost will be mostly not yours.
All right, let's give Dr. Galbraith a big round of applause.
There is a CDR thing tomorrow at the Bernie headquarters on 7th Street at 6 p.m. So if you want to register people to vote for the deadline of March 1st, you can get registered there. As well as the voter registration drive this Thursday on the UT campus if you want to participate in that.
And if there are those in the room who don't have current voter registration, there's several of us in here that can update it or moved or if your name has changed, then we should get that in and get those registrations in order to vote the timer. You can receive by February 3rd.